My husband left me because he said I was a broken woman who could never give him a child. He said it in the calmest voice imaginable. No shouting. No anger. Just a quiet sentence that shattered 12 years of marriage. I remember the exact way he leaned back in his chair that night, his fingers loosely wrapped around a glass of red wine, as if we were discussing something ordinary, like weekend plans or grocery lists. I want a real family, he said. A real family. As if the life we had built together somehow didn't count. As if the house we had paid for brick by brick, the holidays we spent decorating the old maple tree in the yard, the years I spent standing beside him while he struggled to build his company, none of it mattered. Because I couldn't give him a child. At least, that's what he believed. I didn't cry. I didn't beg him to stay. Instead, I did something that confused him even more. I smiled. And that was the first moment he underestimated me. What happened 17 years later shocked everyone who thought they knew our story. But before I tell you how I walked into his charity gala with 4 people he never expected to see, let me start from the beginning. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from. I always find it amazing how far these stories travel. 17 years is a long time to carry a secret. And some truths don't disappear with time. They grow sharper. Underscore 2 days before my husband asked for the divorce. Life still looked normal from the outside. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The late autumn sun filtered gently through the lace curtains in our kitchen, painting soft patterns across the old oak table where I had eaten breakfast almost every morning for over a decade. I remember setting out 2 cups of coffee like I always did. One for me, one for Daniel. That had been our routine since the early years of our marriage. Coffee at 7. A quick conversation about the day ahead. Sometimes silence. But comfortable silence. Back then, I still believed that silence meant peace. The house itself was modest compared to the large suburban homes surrounding it in our neighborhood outside Denver. But it was ours. Every corner held a memory. The dent in the hallway wall from when Daniel tried to move a dresser by himself. The garden in the backyard where I had planted roses the first spring after we got married. The guest room that had once been meant for a baby. That room stayed empty for years. At first, we joked about it. Plenty of time, Daniel used to say. We were in our early 30s then, full of plans and confidence. But after a few years, the jokes faded. Doctor visits replaced optimism. Test results replaced hope. And quiet disappointment began to fill the spaces between us. The doctors told us conception might be difficult. Not impossible, just difficult. But somewhere along the way, Daniel stopped hearing the word difficult. All he heard was never. That Tuesday afternoon, I was washing dishes when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something, an instinct I still can't fully explain, made me answer. Hello. There was a pause on the other end. Then a woman's voice spoke. Soft. Careful. Is this Margaret Lawson? Yes. My name is Claire Whitmore, she said. I'm calling because I think there's something you deserve to know. Her voice carried a strange tension, like someone holding a fragile glass that might shatter if they spoke too loudly. I'm sorry to call you like this, she continued. But I've been debating whether to tell you for weeks. My fingers tightened around the edge of the kitchen counter. Tell me what? Another pause. Longer this time. Finally, she said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. It's about your husband. At that moment, I assumed the worst. An accident. A medical emergency. But the truth she carried was something very different. Something far colder. I work at the fertility clinic on Maple Avenue, she said quietly. My heart skipped. Daniel had visited that clinic months earlier for routine tests. Tests we were both supposed to take. Except, he had insisted on going alone. Your husband came in for a follow-up consultation last month, Claire continued carefully. And I saw something that didn't feel right. I didn't speak. Outside the window, the wind moved gently through the maple tree in our yard. Inside the house, everything felt still. Too still. Mrs. Lawson, she said gently, there are things about your medical records that your husband may not have told you. I remember standing there in the quiet kitchen, the phone pressed against my ear, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Not panic. Not fear. Just clarity. Because sometimes, deep down, we already know the truth long before someone says it out loud. And something in Claire's voice told me that the story of my infertility wasn't the whole truth. Not even close. But I had no idea yet how deep that lie would go, or how long it would take before the world finally heard the truth. 17 years later, it would all come out under the bright lights of a charity gala Daniel thought he controlled. He just didn't realize that the night he called me broken, he was the one hiding the biggest secret of all. The phone call with Claire ended, but her words stayed in the kitchen long after the line went silent. I stood there for several minutes without moving. The coffee on the counter had already gone cold. Daniel would be home soon. Normally, I would have rushed to finish dinner before he arrived. That had always been our rhythm, small routines that made a marriage feel stable. But that afternoon, something inside me shifted. For the first time in years, I stopped trying to fix things. Instead, I waited. The sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway came a little after 6. I recognized the engine immediately. After 12 years of marriage, you learn the small sounds that belong to someone. The garage door opened. Then the front door. "Margaret," he called. "I'm in the kitchen." He walked in, loosening his tie the way he always did after work. His suit jacket hung over one shoulder, and he looked tired, but not unhappy. That detail stayed with me later. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't guilty. If anything, he looked like a man who had already made up his mind. "You made coffee?" he asked, noticing the 2 cups on the table. I did. He sat down across from me and took a sip. Then he frowned slightly. "It's cold. I made it hours ago." For a moment neither of us spoke. Outside, the evening light had started to fade, leaving the kitchen wrapped in a quiet gray glow. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Margaret, we need to talk." I had heard those words before. In movies. They always sounded dramatic on screen. In real life, they were strangely calm. "What about?" I asked. He looked down at his hands. Then he said it. "I met someone." There it was. Simple. Direct. Almost polite. I waited for the rush of emotion people always describe in those moments. The anger. The heartbreak. The shock. But none of it came. Maybe Claire's phone call had already prepared me. "Who is she?" I asked quietly. "Her name is Vanessa." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I could already imagine her. Younger. Confident. Someone who still believed life moved in straight lines instead of complicated circles. Daniel rubbed his temples before continuing. "She wants children," he said. The way he said it felt rehearsed, like a sentence he had practiced many times before speaking it out loud. "And you don't?" I asked. "That's not what I mean." He looked up at me then, and there was something almost defensive in his eyes. "I do want children, Margaret. You know that." The air between us grew heavy. For years we had carried the quiet weight of doctor appointments and test results. For years we had pretended the uncertainty didn't matter. But now it had become the center of everything. The doctors said it might take time. I reminded him. They also said it might never happen. He said the word never like a final verdict. Then he leaned back in his chair. "I'm 39, he continued. "If I'm going to have a family, I can't keep waiting." There it was again. That word. Family. As if the woman sitting across from him wasn't already part of one. I studied his face carefully. This wasn't anger. It wasn't even cruelty. It was something colder. Calculation. He had already decided how the story would end. "You're leaving?" I said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded slowly. "I think it's the best thing for both of us." For both of us. People often wrap selfish decisions in gentle language. It makes them easier to live with. "When?" I asked. "I've already signed a lease for an apartment downtown." Of course he had. The plan was already in motion. "I'll move out this weekend." I looked around the kitchen. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar, like a place I was visiting instead of the home I had built over 12 years. "What about the house?" I asked. "We'll sell it," Daniel said quickly. "Split the money." Practical. Efficient. Everything neatly arranged. Almost as if our marriage had been a business contract rather than a life. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel said the sentence I would remember for the rest of my life. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but I can't spend the rest of my life with someone who can't give me a child." The words hung in the air between us. Cold. Final. And incredibly wrong. Because only a few hours earlier, a woman from the fertility clinic had called to tell me something Daniel clearly didn't want me to know. But I didn't reveal that truth. Not then. Instead, I did something that confused him. I smiled. A small, calm smile. If Daniel noticed how strange that was, he didn't mention it. Maybe he thought I was in shock. Maybe he thought I had already accepted my role in the story he had created. The broken woman. The wife who couldn't give him the family he wanted. What he didn't understand was that the story he believed wasn't the real one. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone lies about you is let them believe you don't know the truth. Because 17 years later, that lie would come back to him in the most public way imaginable. And when it did, he wouldn't be the one walking away with dignity. Daniel moved out 3 days later. It happened on a gray Saturday morning that felt strangely ordinary. No shouting. No dramatic arguments. Just cardboard boxes. 2 movers carried his things through the front door while I stood near the kitchen window, watching the maple tree sway gently in the autumn wind. That tree had been there longer than our marriage. It had seen us move in as newlyweds. It had seen birthdays, barbecues, quiet Sunday mornings. Now it watched my husband leave. Daniel moved efficiently, almost professionally, as if he were closing a chapter in a book he had already finished reading. He didn't look back much. Every now and then he asked simple questions. Where's the rest of my files? Did you see my watch case? Normal questions. Like he was moving between apartments instead of ending a 12-year marriage. Around noon, the last box was loaded into the truck. Daniel walked back into the kitchen one final time. He looked around the room slowly. I wondered if he was remembering the same things I was. The mornings we drank coffee together. The nights we stayed up late talking about the future. The plans we once believed in. But if he was remembering those things, he didn't show it. Well, he said quietly. I nodded. Well, there was a long pause between us. I'll call the realtor on Monday, he said. We should probably list the house soon. Of course. Another practical detail. Another clean ending. I folded my hands calmly on the table. That's fine. Daniel hesitated for a moment. Then he said something that almost sounded kind. I do hope you'll be okay, Margaret. I looked at him. For a brief second, I saw the man I had married all those years ago. The man who used to laugh easily. The man who once held my hand while we walked through that same backyard garden. But that version of Daniel had been fading for a long time. I will be, I said. And strangely enough, I meant it. He nodded. Then he picked up his keys and walked out the door. The sound of his car pulling away down the street echoed through the quiet house. And just like that, my marriage was over. Underscore. The first few weeks after the divorce were the hardest. Not because I missed Daniel, but because of the silence. When you spend over a decade sharing a home with someone, the quiet can feel overwhelming. Every room seemed too large. Every evening stretched too long. Friends tried to help. Some invited me to dinner. Others offered advice I hadn't asked for. You're still young, one neighbor said kindly. You'll meet someone else. But starting over wasn't the first thing on my mind. Survival was. Daniel had moved on quickly. Within 6 months, I heard through mutual friends that he had married Vanessa. Apparently, she was 10 years younger. Bright. Ambitious. And according to the gossip traveling through our old social circle, she was already expecting a baby. The news traveled fast. It always does in suburban neighborhoods. I heard it while standing in line at the grocery store. 2 women behind me were whispering. Did you hear about Daniel Lawson? Yes. His new wife is pregnant already. Their voices lowered slightly. I guess the problem really was Margaret. I didn't turn around. I didn't correct them. I simply paid for my groceries and walked out of the store. Because sometimes the truth isn't something you rush to defend. Sometimes you wait. The house sold that spring. I moved into a small townhouse about 20 minutes away. It wasn't large, but it was peaceful. For the first time in years, the future felt open instead of predetermined. I began working more hours at the accounting firm where I had been employed part-time during my marriage. At first it was just a way to stay busy. But something unexpected happened. I realized I was good at it. Very good. Numbers had always made sense to me. They followed rules. They didn't lie. Within 2 years, I was managing several major clients. Within 5 years, I had become a partner in the firm. Life slowly rebuilt itself. Different, but stable. Meanwhile, Daniel's life seemed to move in a completely different direction. Through occasional news and old acquaintances, I learned that his company was growing rapidly. His construction business expanded across several states. New projects, new investors, new headlines in the local business pages. Daniel Lawson was becoming successful. Very successful. And of course, there were photos. Sometimes I would see them online. Daniel standing beside Vanessa at charity events. both of them smiling for cameras. Two small children standing between them. A perfect family. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. 17 years passed faster than I expected. Seasons changed. Neighbors came and went. The maple tree at my old house grew taller. And I built a life that had nothing to do with the man who once called me broken. Until one evening, 17 years after our divorce, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Thick. Elegant. The return address belonged to a luxury hotel in downtown Denver. Inside was a formal invitation printed on heavy cream-colored paper. I read the first line slowly. Daniel Lawson cordially invites you to the 17th Annual Lawson Foundation Charity Gala. For a long moment, I simply stared at the card. Daniel had no idea who would be walking into that gala. And more importantly, he had no idea who would be walking in with me. I kept the invitation on my kitchen table for 3 days before touching it again. The envelope itself was expensive. Heavy paper. Gold lettering. The kind of invitation people send when they want the world to see how successful they've become. At the top of the card, Daniel's name stood in elegant script. Daniel Lawson, founder of the Lawson Foundation. 17 years ago, that name had been signed at the bottom of divorce papers. Now it was printed on charity invitations sent across the city. Life has a strange way of rearranging things. I set the card down and poured myself a cup of tea. The townhouse was quiet that evening, just like most evenings had been for the past decade. But this silence was different. It carried memories. Because the moment I saw Daniel's name again, I thought about the one person who had changed everything on the day my marriage ended. Claire Whitmore, the woman from the fertility clinic. The woman who had called me that Tuesday afternoon all those years ago. Underscore. After Daniel left the house that night, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The lights were off. Only the small lamp above the sink was glowing. My phone rested on the table in front of me. Claire had told me something during that call. Something she wasn't even sure she should say. I know I shouldn't discuss patient records, she had said carefully. But I saw something in your file that doesn't match the story your husband told. Her voice had sounded nervous. Like someone stepping into a conversation they weren't supposed to be part of. What do you mean? I asked her. Another pause. Then she said something that changed everything. The test results from your evaluation were normal. I remember gripping the phone tighter. Normal? Yes. Her voice lowered. But your husband's test results were not. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because I was shocked, but because something inside me suddenly made sense. All those months Daniel insisted on handling the clinic appointments himself. All the times he said the doctors had confirmed the issue. All the moments he refused to discuss details. Claire continued quietly. I shouldn't even be telling you this. But when I saw the notes in the system, I realized you might not know the truth. The truth. It turned out that the truth was very simple. Daniel Lawson, the man who said I was a broken woman, had been the one unable to have children. The test results were clear. The diagnosis had been confirmed. But instead of facing it, he rewrote the story. And I became the reason our marriage failed. I never confronted him. Not that night. Not during the divorce. Not in the years that followed. Some people might wonder why. The answer is surprisingly simple. Because by the time I learned the truth, Daniel had already decided who I was in his story. The broken wife. The woman who couldn't give him a family. And the moment he believed that lie, he stopped looking for the truth. So I let him believe it. Sometimes silence reveals more than arguments ever could. The months after the divorce passed quietly. I focused on rebuilding my life. Working longer hours. Learning new skills. Slowly turning my job into something bigger. But every once in a while, I thought about Claire. About the secret she had trusted me with. About the truth that existed quietly behind Daniel's version of events. I kept one document from the clinic. Just one. Claire had mailed it to me weeks after that phone call. A copy of the test results. Official. Signed. Clear. I placed it in a folder and locked it inside a small metal filing box in my office. For years, it stayed there. Unseen. Unmentioned. A truth waiting patiently for the right moment. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I understood something Daniel didn't. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone refuses to acknowledge it. It waits. Quietly. Underscore, 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 underscore. 17 years later, I opened that filing box again. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with time, but the words were still perfectly clear. Patient, Daniel Lawson diagnosis. Male factor infertility. I placed the document back in the folder. Then I looked at the gala invitation again. The Lawson Foundation Charity Gala. According to the card, it would be the largest event Daniel's organization had ever hosted. Business leaders, investors, local media, nearly 500 guests. A room full of people who believed they knew Daniel Lawson's story. But there was something Daniel had never expected. The past has a way of walking into the room when you least expect it. And this time, I wouldn't be arriving alone. Because 3 days after the invitation arrived, I made 4 phone calls. And every single person I contacted agreed to come with me to that gala. The strange thing about rebuilding your life is that it rarely happens all at once. There's no single morning where you wake up and suddenly feel strong again. It happens quietly, piece by piece, day by day, and most of the time, you don't even notice the change until years later. That's how it happened for me. After the divorce, my world became very small for a while. Work, home, occasional dinners with a few friends who stayed loyal after Daniel and I separated. But small doesn't always mean empty. Sometimes small means peaceful. Underscore, 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 underscore. At the time of the divorce, I had been working part-time at a local accounting firm. It wasn't glamorous. Mostly small business clients, tax preparation, financial reports. But I had always liked numbers. Numbers follow rules. 2 plus 2 always equals 4. Unlike people, numbers don't change their story depending on what's convenient. After Daniel left, I asked the managing partner if I could increase my hours. At first, it was simply about stability. I needed to support myself. The money from selling the house helped, but I wanted something of my own. Are you sure you're ready for full-time work? My boss asked gently. His name was Robert Gaines, a patient man in his 60s who had built the firm from a tiny office into a respectable local business. I'm sure, I told him. And I was. Because work gave me something Daniel had taken with him when he left. Focus. Within a year, I was handling some of the firm's most complicated clients. Small construction companies, local contractors, developers trying to manage growing businesses. Ironically, the same kind of industry Daniel worked in. Maybe that's why I understood their financial challenges so well. I stayed late most evenings. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I enjoyed solving the problems. Gradually, my role at the firm grew. New clients requested to work specifically with me. Robert began including me in strategy meetings. 5 years after my divorce, he invited me into his office one afternoon. I've been watching your work, he said. I thought I might be in trouble. Instead, he smiled. I think it's time we talked about partnership. I stared at him for a moment. Partnership? You've earned it, he said simply. That was the day my life truly changed. Underscore, 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 underscore. Meanwhile, Daniel's life seemed to follow a very different path. Through occasional conversations and the kind of small-town news that travels quickly, I heard updates about him over the years. His construction company expanded rapidly. New contracts, large commercial developments, a few magazine articles featuring his success story. Apparently, he had a talent for business. The same ambition that once drove him to work late nights during our marriage was now building something much bigger. And of course, there was the family he always said he wanted. Photos occasionally appeared online. Daniel and Vanessa at charity dinners. Daniel and Vanessa standing beside 2 children. A boy and a girl. Perfect smiles for the camera. A perfect picture of the life he had chosen. Sometimes people would mention it to me. Usually with a careful tone. I saw Daniel the other day, someone would say. He seems to be doing very well. I always answered the same way. I'm glad. And I meant it. Because holding on to bitterness for 17 years would only poison my own life. Instead, I focused on building something steady. Something real. Underscore, 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 underscore. By the time I turned 62, my life looked very different from the one I had imagined as a young bride. But it wasn't worse. In many ways, it was better. The accounting firm had grown. Our client list had tripled. Robert eventually retired, and I became the senior partner. The small townhouse I bought after the divorce was long since paid off. I traveled occasionally. Nothing extravagant. Just quiet trips to places I had always wanted to see. Maine in the fall. Sedona during the winter. A small coastal town in Oregon where the ocean felt endless and calm. Life had become peaceful in a way I never expected. The past stayed where it belonged. In the past. At least, until that gala invitation arrived. I picked up the phone 3 days after opening Daniel's letter. The first call was to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. But I knew she would remember me. Hello, a woman answered. Claire, I asked. A short pause. Yes, who is this? It's Margaret Lawson. Another pause. Then a small gasp. Oh my goodness, she said. Margaret, it's been a long time. 17 years, to be exact. We spoke for nearly an hour. About life. About time passing. And eventually, about the secret she once shared with me. When I told her about Daniel's upcoming charity gala, Claire grew quiet. That must feel strange, she said. It does. Then I asked the question that mattered. Claire, would you be willing to come with me? Another long silence. Finally she said something that made me smile. I always wondered if the truth would come out one day. So did I. Then she gave her answer. Yes, Margaret. I'll come. One down. 3 more calls to make. And every one of them would bring a piece of the truth Daniel Lawson had hidden for 17 years. The second phone call was harder to make. Not because I doubted the person would answer, but because I wasn't sure how the conversation would begin after so many years. I sat at my kitchen table that afternoon with the gala invitation lying beside my phone. Daniel's name stared back at me from the cream-colored card. 17 years. That's a long time for people to believe a story. A long time for a lie to settle into everyone's memory. But lies have one weakness. They rely on silence. And silence can end at any moment. I picked up the phone and dialed the next number. It rang twice. Then a familiar voice answered. Lawson Development. For a moment, I almost laughed at the coincidence. Even after all these years, Daniel's company name still carried our old last name. I'd like to speak with Mr. Henry Callahan, I said. The receptionist paused. And may I ask who's calling? My name is Margaret Lawson. Another pause. The kind that happens when someone recognizes a name they haven't heard in a long time. Just a moment. The line clicked. Soft instrumental music played through the receiver while I waited. Henry Callahan had once been Daniel's business partner during the early years of his construction company. Back when our marriage was still intact. Back when Daniel worked late nights drafting project plans at the kitchen table. Back when Henry often joined us for dinner after long meetings. He had always been a fair man. Careful with details. Honest in a way that made him stand out in the construction world. Eventually, he sold his share of the company and moved on to other investments. But during the divorce, he was one of the few people who looked uncomfortable about how quickly Daniel ended things. The music stopped. Then Henry's voice came on the line. Margaret. It's been a while, Henry. Well, that's an understatement. He sounded surprised, but not unfriendly. How are you? I'm doing well, I said. And you? Still working too much? He replied with a small laugh. That hasn't changed. We exchanged a few polite updates. 17 years of life summarized in a few careful sentences. Then I moved to the reason for the call. Henry, I received an invitation today. Oh, Daniel's charity gala. There was a short silence on the other end. Yes, he said finally. It's a big event this year. Investors, press, city officials. That's what I heard. Another pause. I assume Daniel didn't send it personally, Henry added. I doubt he even knows I received one. Henry chuckled quietly. That sounds about right. Then I asked the question that mattered. Henry, would you be willing to attend that gala with me? The silence this time lasted longer. I could almost hear him thinking. Margaret, he said slowly, are you planning to make a scene? No, the answer came easily. Because it was the truth. I'm planning to tell the truth. Another pause. Then Henry let out a quiet breath. I always wondered if that day would come. So did I. You know, Daniel built his reputation carefully over the years, Henry said. I know. He's very respected in this city now. I know that too. But you still want to walk into his biggest event with what exactly? I looked at the folder on the table beside me. Inside was the clinic report. The document Daniel had spent 17 years hoping would stay hidden. With the truth, I said calmly. Henry didn't answer right away. Then he asked a simple question. Does Vanessa know? I don't think so. Another quiet breath through the phone. Well, Henry said slowly. This might be the most honest charity gala Denver has ever seen. Despite everything, I smiled. So you'll come? Yes. His answer was firm now. I'll come. 2 people confirmed. 2 more to go. Underscore. The third call was easier. Because the person I needed to reach had been waiting a long time to hear from me. His name was David Ramirez. 17 years earlier, he had been the attorney who handled my divorce. A sharp legal mind with a reputation for patience and precision. Back then, I had chosen him because he listened carefully before speaking. And during the divorce negotiations, he had asked me a question I never forgot. "Are you sure there isn't more to this story?" he said one afternoon in his office. At the time, I simply shook my head. Yes. Because revealing Daniel's medical results would have turned the entire divorce into a courtroom battle. And at that moment in my life, peace mattered more than proving a point. But now things were different. When David answered the phone, he recognized my voice almost immediately. "Margaret Lawson," he said. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. I hope that's not a bad thing." "Not at all," he said warmly. "What can I do for you?" I glanced again at the invitation. "I received an interesting letter today." "Oh, a charity gala hosted by my ex-husband." David laughed softly. "That should be entertaining." "Yes," I said. "I think it will be." Then I asked him the same question. "David, would you be willing to attend with me?" He didn't even hesitate. "Absolutely." 3 people now stood beside me. 3 pieces of the truth Daniel had buried long ago. But the 4th person, the 4th face that would walk into that ballroom with me, was the one Daniel would never expect to see. And when he did, the story he had told the world for 17 years would begin to fall apart. By the time I finished the 3rd phone call, the sun had already set outside my kitchen window. The house was quiet again, the same quiet that had surrounded me for years. But this time it felt different. For the first time in a long while, the past wasn't something I was simply remembering. It was something that was about to walk back into the present. 3 people had already agreed to stand beside me at Daniel's gala. Claire Whitmore, Henry Callahan, David Ramirez. Each of them held a piece of a story Daniel had spent 17 years rewriting. But there was still one more call to make. And this was the only one that made me hesitate. Not because the person would refuse, but because the conversation would reopen something personal. Something I had kept private for a very long time. I stared at the phone for several minutes before dialing the number. The line rang once, twice. Then a young man's voice answered. "Hello." For a moment, I didn't say anything. Hearing his voice still surprised me sometimes. "Hello," he repeated. "It's me," I said softly. A short pause. Then his tone changed immediately. "Mom." A small smile appeared on my face. "Yes, Ethan." Ethan Lawson was 16 years old the first time I met him. He's 33 now. And no, he isn't Daniel's son. But he became something even more important in my life. I met Ethan 5 years after my divorce. At the time, I had already started building my career at the accounting firm. Work kept me busy, but there was still a quiet space in my life that felt unfinished. One evening, a colleague invited me to volunteer at a youth mentoring program. It worked with teenagers who had grown up in difficult circumstances, kids who needed guidance, someone to listen. At first, I wasn't sure if I belonged there. But during one of the early meetings, I met Ethan. He was sitting alone at the end of a long table, staring down at a math worksheet. The room was full of noise and conversation, but he barely looked up. "Need some help with that?" I asked. He shrugged. Maybe. Math had never been his strongest subject. But that wasn't really the issue. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about him. Ethan had grown up moving between foster homes. His biological parents were gone. Most adults in his life had come and gone quickly. Trust didn't come easily for him. But numbers helped. Numbers were predictable, just like they were for me. So every Thursday evening, we sat at the same table working through algebra problems together. At first he barely spoke. But slowly, conversation started to grow between us. School, sports, music he liked, movies I had never heard of. Months passed. Then one evening he asked a question that caught me off guard. "Why do you keep coming back?" "What do you mean?" "You don't have to be here," he said. "Most people stop volunteering after a few weeks." I thought about that for a moment. Then I told him the truth. Because someone once told me I couldn't have a family. Ethan looked confused. And I decided they were wrong. From that moment forward, something changed between us. A year later, when Ethan turned 18, he asked if he could keep in touch after leaving the program. Of course I said yes. Over time, our relationship grew into something that felt natural. He called for advice about college. I attended his graduation. When he landed his first job, we celebrated with dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown. Eventually, the word Margaret disappeared from his phone contacts. It was replaced by something much simpler. Mom. Not because I asked for it, but because that's what our relationship had quietly become. Family. The kind Daniel once said I could never have. For now, years later, Ethan was living in Denver and working as a structural engineer. Ironically, not far from the same construction industry Daniel had built his fortune in. Mom, everything okay? He asked over the phone. Yes, I said. I just wanted to talk to you about something. Sure. I glanced again at the gala invitation on the table. You remember Daniel Lawson? I asked. There was a short pause. My ex-husband. Yeah, Ethan said carefully. The one who blamed you for everything. That's right. Another pause. Then he asked the question I expected. What about him? He's hosting a charity gala next month. And I'm going. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Then he laughed softly. Well, that should be interesting. Yes, I said. I think it will be. Then I asked the final question. Would you come with me? His answer came without hesitation. Of course I will. I felt a quiet warmth settle in my chest. Good, I said. Because when we walk into that ballroom, Daniel would see four faces he never expected. A nurse who knew the truth. A former business partner who watched the story unfold. A lawyer who understood the legal details. And the son I found when the world said I couldn't have a family. The truth was finally ready to step into the light. And Daniel Lawson had just invited all of us to the same room. The night of Daniel's charity gala arrived faster than I expected. For weeks, the invitation had sat quietly on my desk. Not forgotten. Just waiting. The event was scheduled for a Friday evening at one of the largest hotels in downtown Denver. The kind of place with tall glass doors, polished marble floors, and chandeliers that seemed designed to impress people the moment they walked inside. Daniel always liked that kind of atmosphere. Success displayed openly. I wasn't nervous. That evening, that surprised me more than anything. 17 years earlier, the thought of seeing Daniel again might have shaken me. But time changes things. 17 years gives a person distance, perspective, and sometimes calm. I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, adjusting the sleeve of a dark blue dress I had chosen for the evening. Nothing extravagant, just simple and elegant. At 62, I had stopped worrying about impressing people. I was only interested in being comfortable in my own skin. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30. Right on time. I walked to the front door and opened it. Ethan was standing on the porch. He looked sharp in a dark suit, though he still had the slightly nervous expression he used to get before big exams back in high school. You look amazing, Mom, he said with a warm smile. So do you. He stepped inside while glancing around the house. You sure you want to do this tonight? He asked. His voice carried concern, not doubt. Yes, I said calmly. I'm sure. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And truth has a way of becoming lighter once it's finally spoken out loud. 10 minutes later, we were in the car heading downtown. Denver's skyline glowed against the evening sky as we drove through the city streets. Traffic grew heavier the closer we got to the hotel. Clearly, Daniel's event was drawing a large crowd. Ethan glanced toward me from the driver's seat. So who are the other three people again? He asked. You'll meet them inside. He smiled. Sounds mysterious. Not mysterious, I said. Just overdue. The hotel entrance was already busy when we arrived. Valet attendants moved quickly between luxury cars. Guests in formal attire stepped out of black SUVs and polished sedans. The entire scene looked like something from a business magazine photo shoot. Daniel had done well for himself. Very well. Ethan parked in the guest garage, and we took the elevator down to the lobby. As the doors opened, the sound of conversation filled the space. Hundreds of people were gathered near the ballroom entrance. Waiters moved between guests carrying trays of champagne. A large banner hung above the double doors. The Lawson Foundation's 17th annual charity gala, Daniel's name stood proudly underneath. Ethan looked up at the banner and raised an eyebrow. Your ex-husband doesn't do things halfway, does he? No, I said. He never did. We walked slowly toward the ballroom entrance. Inside, the room was even more impressive than the lobby. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across dozens of round tables covered in white linen. A stage had been set up at the front of the room for speeches. Large screens displayed photos of charity projects funded by the Lawson Foundation, children's hospitals, community centers, scholarship programs. Daniel had built quite a reputation for generosity. Guests were mingling everywhere. Business leaders, local politicians, members of the press. Nearly 500 people, just like the invitation promised. But Daniel Lawson hadn't seen me yet. Claire was the first person I spotted. She stood near the far wall beside a tall table, looking slightly uncomfortable in a silver evening dress. The moment she saw me, her eyes widened. Margaret, she said softly as we approached. Claire. We embraced briefly. 17 years had added a few lines to both of our faces, but her warm smile was exactly the same. You made it, she said. I said I would. She glanced toward Ethan. And this must be my son, I said. Ethan extended his hand politely. Nice to meet you. Claire smiled warmly. Nice to meet you too. A few minutes later, Henry Callahan joined us. He looked older, of course, but still carried the same confident posture I remembered from years ago. Well, he said, looking around the ballroom. Daniel certainly went all out. That's his style, I replied. Then David Ramirez appeared, adjusting his tie as he walked over. Margaret, he said with a grin. After 17 years, I have to admit, I've been curious how this story would end. I smiled calmly. Tonight we might find out. For people now stood beside me. For faces Daniel never expected to see together. Across the ballroom, a sudden wave of applause began to rise. The crowd was turning toward the stage. Daniel had just entered the room, and in a few minutes, he was going to see something that would change the entire evening. The applause grew louder as Daniel walked toward the stage. From across the ballroom, I could see him clearly now. 17 years had changed him, but not as much as I expected. His hair had turned mostly gray, though it was still neatly styled. His posture remained confident, the same steady walk I remembered from our early years together. Daniel Lawson had aged into the kind of man people described as distinguished. The kind of man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. And tonight, that room was giving him exactly what he expected. Respect. Admiration. The kind of applause that follows a man who has built a public reputation carefully over many years. Ethan stood beside me, watching the crowd. That's him, he asked quietly. Yes, I said. That's Daniel. Ethan studied him for a moment. I see why people listen to him. Daniel had always been good at that. Speaking. Convincing people. Building a story others wanted to believe. On stage, a woman from the foundation stepped forward to introduce him. Ladies and gentlemen, she said into the microphone. Please welcome the founder of the Lawson Foundation, a man whose generosity has helped transform communities across Colorado. Mr. Daniel Lawson. The applause swelled again. Daniel smiled, shook her hand, and stepped up to the microphone. For a brief moment, I saw the same confident expression he used to wear during business presentations at home. The look of a man completely comfortable in control of a room. Thank you, he said, raising a hand slightly to quiet the audience. His voice carried clearly across the ballroom. 17 years ago, this foundation started with a simple idea. Large screens behind him lit up with images of charity projects. Hospitals, schools, families receiving support. Daniel continued speaking with smooth confidence. Success means nothing unless you use it to help others. The audience nodded. Some guests lifted their glasses in quiet agreement. He had learned how to tell his story well. Daniel paused for a moment, scanning the room slowly, probably searching for investors, important guests, local officials, people who mattered to his reputation. Then his eyes moved toward the back of the ballroom, toward our table, and for the first time that night, Daniel Lawson stopped speaking. It was subtle. Most people in the room probably didn't notice. But I saw it immediately. His expression changed. Just slightly. The confidence in his eyes flickered. Because he had recognized me. 17 years is a long time. But some faces don't disappear from memory. Especially not the one you once told the world was broken. The silence lasted only a second. Then Daniel forced a polite smile and continued his speech. But his focus wasn't steady anymore. Now he kept glancing in our direction, trying to understand what he was seeing. 5 people standing together near the center of the ballroom. Me, Ethan, Claire, Henry, David, for faces he never expected to see in the same room. And one woman he believed had disappeared quietly from his life. Beside me, Henry leaned slightly closer. "I think he just saw you," he murmured. "Yes," I said calmly. "I think he did." Claire folded her hands nervously. "I suddenly feel like we walked into a courtroom instead of a charity event." David chuckled quietly. "In a way, we did." Daniel finished his speech a few minutes later. The applause returned, but it felt slightly different now. Less smooth. Less certain. Because Daniel's attention was divided. When he stepped down from the stage, several guests approached him immediately. Investors, reporters, board members. But I could see something else in his behavior. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted back toward our table, trying to understand why we were there, trying to figure out what this meant. Ethan noticed it too. "He keeps looking over here," he whispered. "Yes." "Do you think he knows?" "I think he remembers enough to be uncomfortable." Across the room, Daniel finally excused himself from a group of guests. Then he began walking toward us. Slowly, carefully, the confident businessman returning to confront a part of his past he thought had disappeared. The conversations around us grew quieter as people noticed his movement. Because when the host of an event walks directly across a ballroom toward someone, people pay attention. Daniel stopped about 3 feet from our table. For a moment, none of us spoke. He looked older up close, more tired than he had appeared from the stage. But the sharp intelligence in his eyes was still there. "Margaret," he said finally. My name sounded unfamiliar in his voice, like a word he hadn't used in a very long time. "Daniel." He glanced briefly at Ethan, then at the others standing beside me. Recognition appeared slowly as he studied their faces. "Claire, Henry, David." His expression tightened, because suddenly the situation no longer looked like a coincidence. "This is unexpected," Daniel said carefully. "I imagine it is," I replied. Around us, the quiet hum of the gala continued. But several nearby guests had clearly started paying attention to our conversation. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "May I ask why you're here tonight?" I met his eyes calmly. "You invited me." His brow furrowed. "I don't recall sending. The Lawson Foundation sent an invitation," I said. "And I decided to accept." Daniel's gaze moved again across the group, standing with me. When his eyes returned to mine, the calm confidence he showed on stage had faded slightly. "What exactly is this about, Margaret?" For a moment, I considered his question. Then I answered honestly. "It's about the truth." And for the first time in 17 years, Daniel Lawson looked genuinely nervous. For a few seconds after I said the word truth, Daniel didn't respond. He just stood there, studying my face carefully. People often think big confrontations are loud, dramatic, full of raised voices. But most of the time, the real tension happens in quiet moments like this one. A crowded ballroom, hundreds of conversations happening around us. And yet, the small circle between Daniel and me suddenly felt very still. Daniel cleared his throat slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the caution underneath it. Because Daniel had always been good at reading situations. And right now, nothing about this situation looked simple. I glanced toward Claire. She gave me a small, encouraging nod. Then I looked back at Daniel. "You told a lot of people a story about our marriage," I said. Daniel's expression tightened. "I'm not interested in discussing our divorce at a charity event," he replied quickly. "That chapter of our lives ended a long time ago." "Yes," I said. "It did." A few nearby guests had begun to glance in our direction. Nothing obvious. Just the natural curiosity people feel when something unusual is happening. Daniel noticed it too. He lowered his voice slightly. "Margaret, if you have something to say, perhaps we should discuss it privately." "I agree," I said calmly. "Except the story you told about me was never private." That made him pause. 17 years earlier, Daniel had explained our divorce the same way to almost everyone. Friends, business partners, family members. His wife, Vanessa. The explanation had always been simple. Margaret couldn't have children. Daniel wanted a family. So he moved on. It was a story that made him look practical, reasonable, even sympathetic. A man who had made a difficult decision. But stories like that rely on something important. No one challenging them. I gestured gently toward Claire. Do you remember the fertility clinic on Maple Avenue? I asked. Daniel blinked. Just once. But it was enough. Because that clinic was where the story truly began. His eyes moved briefly toward Claire. Then back to me. I don't see how that's relevant, he said. Claire stepped forward slightly. Her voice was quiet, but steady. My name is Claire Whitmore, she said. I worked at that clinic 17 years ago. Daniel's face didn't change much, but the muscles along his jaw tightened. I'm sure the clinic handled thousands of patients, he replied. Probably, Claire said gently. But I remember you. The silence between them stretched for a moment. Around us, the gala continued. Music played softly. Waiters carried trays of drinks between tables. But several people nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. His reputation had always been important to him. Carefully built. Carefully maintained. What exactly are you implying? He asked quietly. I reached into my purse and removed the folder I had carried with me that evening. The same folder that had sat in my filing box for 17 years. Inside was a single document. I placed it carefully on the table between us. Daniel looked down at it. Then back at me. What is this? The truth, I said. For a moment he didn't move. Then slowly, he opened the folder. His eyes moved across the page. Line by line. The room around us seemed to fade slightly as he read. Because the words on that paper were very clear. Patient, Daniel Lawson diagnosis. Male infertility. For a few seconds, Daniel simply stared at the report. Then he looked up again. His expression had changed completely now. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just stunned. Claire spoke softly. That report was finalized 2 weeks before your divorce filing. Daniel's eyes shifted toward her. You had access to confidential records? He said sharply. I had access to the truth, she replied calmly. Henry stepped forward slightly. I remember those months, he added. You told everyone Margaret couldn't have children. Daniel's attention moved to him next. Henry, this is not your business. Maybe not, Henry said. But honesty usually is. By now, the tension around our table had become impossible to ignore. A few nearby guests had stopped their conversations completely. Someone from the event staff was watching carefully from across the room. Daniel glanced around quickly. The situation was slipping out of his control, and he knew it. He lowered his voice again. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here? His question sounded less confident now, more cautious. I folded my hands calmly. I'm not trying to accomplish anything, Daniel. Then why bring this up now? Because for 17 years, you told people I was the reason our marriage ended. Daniel didn't answer. Tonight, I continued gently. I just wanted you to see the truth again. His eyes drifted back down to the paper, then slowly around the table. Claire, Henry, David, Ethan, for faces, for witnesses, for reminders that the story he told the world wasn't the real one. And for the first time since I had seen him walk into the ballroom that night, Daniel Lawson had no idea what to say next. Daniel kept staring at the document. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. The ballroom noise slowly returned around us. Soft music, quiet conversations, glasses clinking. But at our table, everything felt heavier. 17 years of silence was sitting on that piece of paper. Finally, Daniel closed the folder. Not gently, not aggressively either, just carefully, like someone handling something fragile. He looked at me. Margaret, he said quietly, this isn't appropriate. I almost smiled. Not because the moment was funny, but because Daniel was doing exactly what he had always done. Trying to control the situation. Trying to guide the narrative. Trying to move the conversation somewhere safer. But this time, he didn't have the same control. 17 years ago, I said calmly, you filed for divorce. Daniel's eyes stayed on mine. You told everyone the reason. His voice tightened slightly. We don't need to revisit that tonight. But you already revisited it, I replied. Many times. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. People were already listening. Not openly, but close enough. That's how events like this work. No one stares. Everyone notices. Claire rested her hands calmly on the table. Her voice was soft when she spoke again. The medical report is accurate, she said. Daniel glanced at her. You're no longer employed at that clinic, he replied quickly. No, Claire said. But records don't disappear just because someone changes jobs. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he looked at Henry, then at David, then finally at Ethan. For faces. For witnesses. And suddenly Daniel realized something important. This wasn't a confrontation. It was confirmation. Confirmation that the truth had never disappeared. It had simply been quiet. Henry spoke next. His tone wasn't hostile, just disappointed. "Daniel, I remember those days very clearly," he said. "You told the whole office Margaret couldn't have children." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. "That was the understanding at the time." Claire shook her head gently. "No," she said. "That was the story." The difference between those two words hung in the air. Understanding. Story. Daniel leaned back slowly. For the first time that evening, his confidence looked thinner. Across the table, Vanessa had gone very still. She hadn't said anything yet, but she had been listening. Very carefully. Her eyes moved from Daniel, to me, to the document still resting on the table. Finally, she spoke. "Daniel," she said quietly. He turned toward her. Her voice was calm, but there was something sharp underneath it. "You told me Margaret couldn't have children." Daniel hesitated, just long enough for the silence to matter. "That's what we believed," he said. Vanessa looked at Claire. "Is that true?" Claire answered gently. "No." Vanessa's fingers tightened around the edge of her glass. "And the report says Daniel is the one who couldn't?" Claire nodded once. "Yes." Daniel spoke quickly now. "Medical reports can be interpreted in different ways." But even he didn't sound convinced by that explanation. David leaned forward slightly. He had been quiet most of the evening, observing, processing. Now his voice was steady. "My mother never told anyone about this," he said. The word mother made several people nearby glance over more openly now. Daniel looked at him sharply. David continued calmly. "She protected your reputation for 17 years. Daniel's face changed slightly at that. "Because that part was true. I never corrected the story. I never defended myself publicly. I never exposed the truth. Not once." Ethan spoke next. "You blamed her," he said quietly. "And she stayed silent." The weight of those words settled slowly over the table. Daniel rubbed his temple. This was no longer just an uncomfortable conversation. This was something else. Something he hadn't prepared for. Across the ballroom, the event host had begun speaking on stage. But almost no one near our table was paying attention anymore. Because people sensed something real was happening here. Not gossip. Not drama. Truth. Daniel finally looked back at me. "Why now?" he asked. It wasn't an angry question. It was a tired one. I answered honestly. "Because I heard about this gala. And I realized something." He waited. I folded my hands gently. "For 17 years, you built a reputation around a lie." Daniel didn't interrupt. "You said I couldn't give you a family." I paused. Then I looked at David and Ethan. Two grown men sitting beside me. Calm. Confident. Strong. I just thought it was time for people to see the full picture. Daniel followed my gaze. To David. Then Ethan. Slowly, a new realization began forming behind his eyes. Not just about the report. Not just about the lie. But about the four faces sitting at that table. Claire. Henry. David. Ethan. For lives connected to a truth he had buried. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Lawson began to understand something. The real surprise of the night hadn't even been revealed yet. Daniel kept looking at David and Ethan. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The music from the stage continued somewhere behind us. But our table had become the quiet center of a much larger room. Because now, everyone nearby understood something important. This conversation wasn't just about a divorce. It was about a story that had been told for 17 years. And the truth that had finally caught up with it. Daniel slowly turned back to me. His voice was lower than before. "What exactly are you implying?" I noticed something different in his tone now. Not arrogance. Not control. Uncertainty. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel looked like a man who wasn't sure what came next. I folded my hands on the table. 17 years ago, I said calmly, when you filed for divorce, you told everyone I couldn't give you a family. Daniel didn't deny it. Because everyone at the table already knew that part. Claire had confirmed the medical report. Henry had confirmed the story Daniel told the office. Vanessa had confirmed what she had been told. The lie had already been exposed. But the real truth was still sitting quietly beside me. David leaned forward slightly. "Mom never corrected the story," he said. Several nearby guests shifted in their chairs. That word again. Mom. Daniel's eyes moved sharply toward him. "You're her son?" he asked slowly. David nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked stunned for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. "And you?" Ethan smiled gently. "Also her son." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened all evening. Because suddenly the pieces no longer fit the version of reality Daniel had believed for 17 years. He looked back at me. But that's impossible. His voice sounded quiet, almost confused. And for the first time that night, I saw something that surprised me. Daniel wasn't angry. He was trying to understand. I spoke gently. After the divorce, I moved to Seattle. Daniel nodded faintly. He remembered that. I started a new life, I continued. I met someone who didn't see me as a problem to solve. I didn't mention my late husband's name. I didn't need to. Some parts of life stay private. But most importantly, I said softly, I discovered something. Daniel waited. The doctor you both insisted on seeing 17 years ago was wrong about me. Daniel blinked. Claire nodded quietly beside us. That happens more often than people think, she said. Early fertility testing wasn't always definitive. Daniel stared at the table. So you could have had children the whole time? I nodded. Yes. He looked at David and Ethan again. Two grown men. Confident. Successful. Calm. Proof of a life he had once believed impossible. Proof of a family he had walked away from. And suddenly the meaning of the title of the gala became strangely ironic. Building futures. Because Daniel had spent years building one version of the future. And I had quietly built another. Vanessa spoke for the first time in several minutes. Her voice was careful. Daniel, did you ever check again? Daniel didn't answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. 17 years ago, he had believed the report that benefited him. The one that allowed him to leave. He had never questioned it. Never tested again. Never looked deeper. Because the story had worked. Until tonight. Henry leaned back in his chair. Well, he said quietly, life has a strange way of balancing things out. David stood up slowly. Ethan followed. Both of them looked at me. Not for permission. Just with quiet respect. Mom, Ethan said softly. You ready? I nodded. Yes. We didn't come here to humiliate Daniel. We didn't come here to destroy anything. The truth had already done its work. I stood from the table. Claire and Henry rose as well. Before leaving, I looked at Daniel one last time. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Just different. Like a man seeing his own past from a new angle. I didn't come here for revenge, I told him calmly. I came here for closure. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. Margaret. But he didn't finish the sentence. Maybe there were too many words. Maybe none of them mattered anymore. I gave him a small, polite smile. Then I turned and walked toward the ballroom exit with David and Ethan beside me. As we stepped outside, the cool evening air felt refreshing. The noise of the gala faded behind us. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Ethan laughed softly. Well, he said, that was something. David smiled. 17 years of silence, he added. I looked at both of them. My sons. The life I built after everything fell apart. And in that moment, I realized something very simple. Daniel Lawson had taken 17 years of my past. But he had never owned my future. That part had always belonged to me.